The tension in conference room B was thick enough to cut with a knife, as Karoline spread her meticulously prepared charts across the mahogany table. Each graph represented hours of analysis, each projection backed by solid data and years of experience. She had handled dozens of clients like Henderson Industries, and her methods had never failed to deliver results that exceeded expectations. "These numbers speak for themselves," she said, pointing to a particularly impressive quarterly growth chart. "Our systematic approach has generated a 38% increase in efficiency for Henderson over the past 18 months. We follow established protocols that have been tested across multiple industries and refined based on measurable outcomes." Amadou leaned back in his chair, studying the presentations with an expression that Karoline couldn't quite read. His dark eyes moved across the data with the intensity of someone who was genuinely trying to understand, but there was something else there too, a kind of patient skepticism that made her defensive instincts flare. "The numbers are certainly impressive," he said finally, his accent adding a musical quality to his words that somehow made even his compliments sound like challenges. "But I spent yesterday talking with Henderson's frontline employees and they paint a different picture." Karoline felt her carefully constructed composure slip slightly. She had expected pushback on methodology or strategic direction, but questioning her data was like questioning her fundamental competence. "I'm not sure what you mean. Our quarterly reports are based on comprehensive metrics gathered from all levels of their organization." "Metrics, yes," Amadou agreed, pulling out a worn leather notebook that looked like it had traveled to a dozen countries. "But metrics only tell part of the story. Did you know that Henderson's customer service representatives are spending 40% more time on each call than they were 2 years ago? Or that their employee turnover rate has increased by 23% in the past 6 months? The confidence that had carried Karoline through 1,000 presentations began to waver. She prided herself on knowing her clients inside and out, but these statistics were news to her. Her reports focused on productivity metrics, cost reduction, and efficiency improvements. She measured success in terms of output per hour, not in terms of employee satisfaction or customer experience quality. Those factors weren't identified as priority areas in Henderson's initial consultation, she said, her voice taking on the cool, professional tone she used when she needed to regain control of a situation. "Our mandate was to improve operational efficiency, which we've accomplished according to every measurable standard." "Ah," Amadou said softly, closing his notebook and leaning forward slightly. "And there's the heart of our disagreement. You see operational efficiency as the goal, but I see it as just one tool among many. When you optimize for efficiency alone, you often create stress fractures in other areas of the system." Karoline found herself studying this man who seemed so comfortable challenging everything she believed about business success. His confidence wasn't the aggressive, dominating presence she was used to encountering in corporate environments. Instead, it was the quiet certainty of someone who had seen enough of the world to trust his own judgment, regardless of what the official procedures might dictate. "Mr. Traoré," she said, choosing her words carefully, "I appreciate your perspective, but Henderson Industries hired Beaumont specifically because of our track record with systematic, proven methodologies. Our clients don't come to us for experimentation, they come to us for results they can count on." "And what happens when those proven methodologies stop working?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than confrontational. "What happens when the world changes faster than the systems can adapt?" The question hit closer to home than Karoline wanted to admit. Over the past year, she had noticed subtle changes in client expectations, shifts in market demands that didn't quite fit into her established frameworks. She had attributed these changes to temporary market fluctuations, confident that her time-tested approaches would eventually prove their worth as they always had. "Change is inevitable," she acknowledged. "But that's exactly why we rely on fundamental principles that have been proven across multiple market cycles. Adaptation doesn't mean abandoning everything that works." "I couldn't agree more," Amadou said, surprising her with his agreement. "But sometimes adaptation means being willing to question which parts of the system are actually working and which parts are just comfortable." The word comfortable hung in the air between them like An accusation. Karoline had built her entire professional identity around being the person who could be counted on, who could deliver predictable results through predictable methods. The suggestion that her confidence might be based on comfort, rather than competence, was deeply unsettling. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, her voice sharper than she had intended. Amadou smiled, and for the first time since he had entered the room, she saw something that looked like genuine enthusiasm. "I'm proposing that we spend 2 weeks working together on the Henderson account. You bring your systematic approach and analytical framework, and I'll bring my field research and adaptive methodology. At the end of 2 weeks, we present Henderson with both approaches and let them decide which direction serves their needs better." The proposal was simultaneously reasonable and completely unacceptable. Reasonable because it gave both approaches a fair trial. Unacceptable because it meant ceding control of a project that should rightfully be hers. Karoline had never worked as someone's equal on a major account. She was accustomed to being the senior consultant, the person who made final decisions and took ultimate responsibility for outcomes. "That's not how we typically structure consultant relationships," she said. "Client confusion increases when multiple methodologies are applied simultaneously. Our success rate is higher when we maintain clear authority structures and consistent strategic direction." "Clear authority structures," Amadou repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I can see how that would be important to you. But what if the situation requires flexibility more than it requires clarity?" The question revealed something that Karoline hadn't quite admitted to herself. Her need for control wasn't just professional, it was personal. She had grown up in a chaotic household where nothing was predictable, where her mother's mood swings and her father's drinking made every day feel like walking through a minefield. Building a career where she could create order from chaos, where she could be the person who made things work reliably, had been her way of healing from that early uncertainty. "Mr. Traoré," she said, standing up and gathering her presentations, with movements that were perhaps a little too precise. "I think we have fundamentally different philosophies about how business consulting should work. I respect your track record, but I don't think collaboration would be productive for either of us." Amadou remained seated, watching her with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "Ms. Matthews," he said quietly, "with respect, I don't think this is about business philosophy at all." The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Beaumont Industries as Karoline Matthews adjusted her perfectly pressed blazer and checked her reflection in the elevator doors. At 34, she had climbed every rung of the corporate ladder with calculated precision, earning her reputation as the company's most formidable department head. Her colleagues whispered about her behind closed doors, calling her the Ice Queen for her unwavering adherence to protocol and her ability to shut down any challenge to her authority with a single glance. Today was particularly important. The quarterly board meeting would determine the future direction of several major projects, and Karoline had spent weeks preparing her presentation. Every slide was perfect, every statistic verified, every potential objection anticipated and countered. She thrived on control, on knowing that she could predict and manage every variable in her professional environment. As she stepped out of the elevator onto the 15th floor, her assistant Jennifer rushed forward with a stack of papers and a concerned expression. "Ms. Matthews, there's been a development with the Henderson account. The new consultant they assigned is asking for a complete overhaul of our established procedures." Karoline's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had handpicked every member of her team based on their willingness to follow her methods without question. The Henderson account was worth $12 million annually, and she had successfully managed similar clients for years using her proven system. The idea that some outsider would waltz in and suggest changes to her carefully crafted processes was not just insulting, it was unacceptable. "Who is this consultant?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular edge that made junior employees scatter. "His name is Amadou Traoré. He comes highly recommended from the Paris office. Apparently, he specializes in unconventional problem-solving approaches." Karoline had heard whispers about the Paris office's methods. They were known for their creative, sometimes chaotic approaches to business solutions. While their results were undeniably impressive, their disregard for proper channels and established hierarchies made her skin crawl. She believed in order, in systems that worked because they had been tested and refined over time. "Schedule a meeting with Mr. Traoré for this afternoon," she instructed Jennifer, "and pull his file. I want to know everything about his background, his methods, and his success rate." As Jennifer hurried away, Karoline retreated to her corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She had worked too hard to build her reputation and her department's success rate to let some maverick consultant undermine everything she had accomplished. Her clients trusted her because they knew exactly what to expect when they worked with her team. Consistency, reliability, and results delivered through proven methodologies. She spent the morning reviewing Traoré's credentials, and despite her reservations, she had to admit they were impressive. He had turned around failing projects in London, Berlin, and Tokyo, using approaches that seemed to fly in the face of conventional business wisdom. His client satisfaction ratings were exceptional, but his reviews from colleagues painted a picture of someone who was brilliant but impossible to manage. One comment from a former supervisor in the London office particularly caught her attention. "Amadou produces extraordinary results, but he refuses to work within established frameworks. He seems to believe that rules are merely suggestions, and his unconventional methods, while effective, create chaos for everyone else involved in the project." Karoline closed the file with a decisive snap. She had built her career on the foundation. That success came from discipline, structure, and respect for hierarchy. If this consultant thought he could walk into her domain and overturn years of proven success with his anarchic approach, he was about to learn otherwise. The afternoon meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in Conference Room B, a space Karoline had specifically chosen for its formal atmosphere and imposing mahogany table. She arrived 10 minutes early, arranging her materials with military precision and positioning herself at the head of the table, where the lighting would cast her in the most authoritative angle. When Amadou Traoré walked through the door at exactly 2 o'clock, he was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of the typical consultant uniform of a navy suit and conservative tie, he wore a charcoal gray jacket over dark jeans, with leather boots that looked like they had actually been walked in. His smile was warm and genuine, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in any room he entered. "Ms. Matthews, I presume," he said, extending his hand with a slight accent that she couldn't quite place. "I've heard impressive things about your department's track record." Karoline shook his hand briefly, noting the calluses that suggested he spent time doing something more physical than shuffling papers. "Mr. Traoré, I understand you have some concerns about our current approach to the Henderson account." "Concerns might be too strong a word," he replied, settling into the chair beside her rather than across from her as she had expected. "I prefer to think of it as seeing opportunities for innovation." The casual way he dismissed her carefully chosen seating arrangement was her first clue that this meeting would not go according to her plan. Karoline prided herself on reading people quickly and accurately, but Amadou seemed to exist outside the normal categories she used to classify and manage her professional relationships. "Our current system has delivered consistent results for Henderson Industries for 3 years running," she began, opening her presentation folder. "Client satisfaction remains at 92%, and we've exceeded their target metrics every quarter." "Impressive," Amadou acknowledged, though something in his tone suggested he was building toward a counter-argument. "And yet Henderson specifically requested a fresh perspective. They're facing challenges that traditional approaches haven't been able to address." Karoline felt the familiar tightening in her chest that occurred whenever someone questioned her methods. She had spent years perfecting her approach, studying successful case histories, and building systems that eliminated variables and uncertainty. The suggestion that her proven methods might be inadequate for handling new challenges felt like a personal attack on everything she had worked to achieve. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between them. Karoline's hand froze on her presentation folder, and for a moment, the perfectly climate-controlled conference room felt stifling. She turned slowly to face Amadou, who was still sitting calmly at the table, his expression neither confrontational nor apologetic. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice carrying the kind of ice that had ended careers and closed deals in her favor. "You heard me correctly," Amadou replied, his tone remaining steady and measured. This conversation isn't really about Henderson Industries or consulting methodologies. It's about something much more personal than that. Karoline felt her professional mask beginning to crack. In her world, personal and professional were kept in separate, sealed compartments. Her colleagues knew her as competent, reliable, and unflappable. They didn't know about the sleepless nights she spent double-checking reports, the way she practiced presentations in her bathroom mirror until every gesture was perfect, or the anxiety that gripped her whenever anything deviated from her carefully planned schedules. "I think you're overstepping professional boundaries, Mr. Traoré," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. Something in his calm certainty had thrown her off balance in a way that no amount of preparation could have prevented, perhaps, he acknowledged, standing up slowly and moving to the window that overlooked the city. But sometimes overstepping boundaries is the only way to address the real issues at hand. Karoline watched him as he gazed out at the urban landscape below. There was something different about the way he carried himself, a kind of centered confidence that she had never quite managed to achieve despite all her professional success. She had spent years building walls around her vulnerability, creating systems and structures that would protect her from the chaos and unpredictability that had defined her childhood. "You don't know anything about me," she said. But the protest lacked conviction. "I know that you've built your entire career around maintaining control," Amadou said without turning from the window. "I know that you've created systems designed to eliminate uncertainty and surprise, and I know that the idea of working with someone who operates outside those systems terrifies you in a way that has nothing to do with professional competence." The accuracy of his observation was like a physical blow. Karoline had spent years perfecting her professional persona, but this stranger had seen through it in the space of a single meeting. Her carefully constructed armor felt suddenly thin and transparent. "That's quite an assumption based on one conversation," she managed. "Is it wrong?" he asked, finally turning to face her. The simple question demanded honesty in a way that made her defensive instincts flare. She could lie, of course. She could retreat behind professional courtesy and end this conversation before it went any further into territory that felt dangerous and unknown. But something in his direct gaze made deception feel impossible. "Even if it weren't," she said carefully, "it wouldn't change the fact that our approaches to this project are incompatible." "Incompatible," Amadou repeated, as if testing the word, or just unfamiliar. He moved away from the window and sat back down at the table, but this time he chose the chair directly across from her. The change in positioning felt deliberate, like he was preparing for a different kind of conversation entirely. "Tell me about the first time you realized that following the rules wasn't enough," he said. The question came out of nowhere and hit her like a sucker punch. Because there had been such a moment years ago when she was still a junior analyst and she had followed every protocol perfectly on a major project, only to watch it fail spectacularly because she had been so focused on procedure that she had missed the human element entirely. "I don't see how that's relevant to the Henderson account," she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Everything is relevant to everything," Amadou replied. "That's the first thing you learn when you stop trying to separate the world into neat categories." Karoline found herself thinking about that failed project from her early career, about how devastated she had been when her meticulous analysis and perfect execution had resulted in a client walking away unsatisfied. She had responded to that failure by building even more comprehensive systems, adding more layers of analysis and control to prevent such surprises from happening again. "Rules exist for a reason," she said. "They represent accumulated wisdom, tested approaches that work across multiple situations. Without structure, everything falls apart." "Some rules, yes," Amadou agreed. "But other rules exist to make us feel safe, even when that safety is an illusion. The question is whether we're brave enough to tell the difference." The conversation had moved so far from anything resembling a normal business meeting that Karoline felt completely unmoored. She was used to negotiations where the parameters were clear, where she could anticipate arguments and prepare responses. This felt more like philosophical sparring, and she was discovering that her usual weapons were useless. "What is it you want from me?" she asked. and was surprised to hear genuine curiosity in her own voice. "I want you to consider the possibility that there might be value in approaches that you haven't tried," Amadou said. "I want you to imagine what might happen if we combined your analytical strengths with methods that can adapt to unexpected circumstances. And if I'm not interested in that kind of experiment, then Henderson Industries will get a competent, predictable solution that addresses the symptoms they've identified without touching the underlying issues that are actually causing their problems." It was a perfectly reasonable statement, delivered without judgment or accusation, but it felt like a direct challenge to everything she had built her career on. The implication was that her methods, while successful, were fundamentally limited in ways that she had never been willing to acknowledge. "Mr. Traoré," she said, choosing her words with the care of someone navigating a diplomatic minefield, "I think you underestimate the value of proven methodologies. Consistency and reliability aren't limitations, they're features. And I think you underestimate your own capacity for adaptation," he replied. "The question is whether you're willing to find out which one of us is right." The challenge was implicit but unmistakable. He was offering her the chance to step outside her carefully constructed comfort zone, to test her abilities in an arena where her usual advantages might not apply. It was exactly the kind of professional risk that her every instinct told her to avoid. But as she looked across the table at this man who seemed so comfortable with uncertainty, she found herself wondering what it would feel like to work without the safety net of absolute control. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, neither of them willing to be the first to break it. Karoline found herself studying Amadou's hands, which were folded calmly on the table surface. They were the hands of someone who had worked, with more than spreadsheets and presentations, weathered and confident in a way that spoke of real-world experience beyond the sterile environments of corporate offices. "You know," Amadou said finally, his voice softer than it had been during their earlier exchange, "I wasn't always comfortable with uncertainty myself." Despite herself, Karoline felt a flicker of curiosity. Throughout their conversation, he had seemed so naturally at ease with chaos and unpredictability that she had assumed it was simply his nature. The idea that his confidence might be learned rather than innate was somehow both reassuring and unsettling. "When I first started consulting," he continued, "I was working with a manufacturing company in Senegal that was losing money every quarter. I spent weeks analyzing their operations, creating detailed reports about efficiency improvements and cost reductions. I had charts, graphs, projections. Everything looked perfect on paper." Karoline found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn, and despite her resistance to his unconventional approach. "The recommendations I made would have saved them 30% on operational cost within 6 months, Amadou said. The client was impressed. My supervisors were pleased. Everyone agreed it was exactly the kind of systematic analysis that separated professional consulting from amateur advice. But something went wrong, Karoline guessed. Something went right, actually, but not in the way I expected. Amadou's smile was rueful. 3 days before implementation was supposed to begin, I was having coffee in a cafe near the factory when I overheard 2 employees talking. They were discussing how the efficiency improvements would eliminate the 15-minute breaks they took to cool down in the shade during the hottest part of the day. Karoline waited, sensing that this story was leading somewhere important. Those breaks weren't in any of the official schedules I had analyzed, Amadou continued. They weren't documented in company policy or reflected in productivity metrics, but they were crucial to employee health and morale in a climate where temperatures regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. My efficient system would have eliminated them, and within a month, we would have faced heat exhaustion injuries, increased absenteeism, and probably a work stoppage. The parallel to her own approach was uncomfortably clear. Karoline had always prided herself on comprehensive analysis, but she realized that her data sources were typically limited to official channels and documented processes. The informal systems that often kept organizations functioning smoothly existed outside the parameters of her standard evaluation methods. So what did you do? She asked. I scrapped my original recommendations and started over, Amadou said. But this time, I spent my analysis period working alongside the employees, rather than studying reports about them. I learned about the rhythms and relationships that made the organization actually function, not just the ones that appeared in organizational charts. And the client was okay with that change in approach? The client was initially skeptical, Amadou admitted. They had hired me based on my reputation for systematic analysis, and suddenly I was suggesting that we needed to understand the human elements before we could optimize the operational elements. It required them to trust that a more complex approach might yield better results than a simpler one. Karoline felt an unwelcome recognition stirring in her chest. She had built her reputation on being the consultant who could deliver clear, quantifiable results through established methodologies. The idea of telling a client that the situation was more complex than initially apparent, that success might require approaches that couldn't be easily measured or predicted, went against everything she had been taught about professional competence. How did you convince them? She asked. I didn't try to convince them, Amadou replied. I asked them to give me 2 weeks to demonstrate what a different approach might reveal, and then we would compare the results with my original analysis. They agreed because the alternative was continuing with a system that clearly wasn't working. The suggestion was startlingly similar to what he had proposed for their collaboration on the Henderson account. Karoline realized that he wasn't asking her to abandon her methods entirely, but to test them against an alternative approach in a real-world situation. The idea was both reasonable and terrifying. And the results? The company became profitable within 8 months and has remained so for the past 5 years, Amadou said. But more importantly, I learned that the most comprehensive analysis in the world is useless if it doesn't account for the human realities that actually drive organizational behavior. Karoline found herself thinking about the Henderson statistics that Amadou had mentioned earlier, the employee turnover rates and customer service call durations that hadn't appeared in her quarterly reports. She had dismissed them as secondary concerns. But what if they were actually indicators of deeper systemic issues, that her efficiency improvements were exacerbating rather than solving? Mr. Traoré, she said slowly, I appreciate your story, but Henderson Industries isn't a manufacturing company in Senegal. The context is completely different. The context is always different, he agreed. That's exactly why rigid adherence to predetermined methodologies can be limiting. Every situation requires an approach that's tailored to its specific circumstances. But how do you maintain quality control without standardized procedures? How do you ensure consistent results across different projects if you're constantly adapting your methods? The questions came from the core of her professional identity. Karoline had built her success on the ability to deliver predictable outcomes through replicable processes. The suggestion that effectiveness might require abandoning that predictability felt like professional suicide. You don't, Amadou said, simply. You give up the illusion of control in exchange for the ability to respond effectively to whatever actually emerges. The honesty of his answer was both refreshing and deeply unsettling. Karoline had spent her career building systems designed to eliminate surprises, and here was someone suggesting that surprises might be valuable sources of information rather than problems to be solved. That sounds like a recipe for chaos, she said. Sometimes, he acknowledged. But chaos isn't always the enemy of effectiveness. Sometimes it's just change trying to happen, and our job is to help it happen in constructive ways rather than trying to prevent it entirely. Karoline looked out the conference room window at the orderly grid of city streets below. From this height, everything looked systematic and controlled. But she knew that at ground level, the reality was much more complex and unpredictable. People made decisions that didn't follow logical patterns. Systems broke down in unexpected ways, and success often came from the ability to adapt to circumstances that no amount of planning could have anticipated. What exactly are you proposing we do with Henderson? She heard herself ask, and was surprised by the question. She hadn't consciously decided to consider his collaboration offer, but something in their conversation had shifted her thinking in ways she didn't quite understand. Amadou's face lit up with genuine surprise and something that might have been respect. Karoline realized that he hadn't expected her to actually consider his proposal, that his challenge had been as much a test of her flexibility as a genuine invitation to collaborate. The recognition that she had surprised him was oddly satisfying. I propose that we approach Henderson as if we're seeing their organization for the first time, he said, leaning forward with renewed energy. Your analytical framework provides the structural understanding, but we supplement it with direct observation and employee interviews. We spend the first week identifying not just what the data says is happening, but what is actually happening on the ground level. Karoline felt her systematic mind immediately begin organizing the proposal into manageable components. That would require significant time investment beyond our standard consultation period. Henderson would need to approve extended access to their personnel and operations. They've already indicated they're willing to try unconventional approaches, Amadou pointed out. The question is whether we're willing to deliver something unconventional enough to be worth their investment. The implications of what he was suggesting began to sink in. Karoline's reputation was built on delivering results through established methodologies that she could defend and explain. If this collaboration failed, it wouldn't just be a single project setback, it would be evidence that her fundamental approach to consulting was inadequate. The professional risk was enormous. But as she considered the alternative, continuing with her standard analysis while ignoring the employee satisfaction and customer service issues that Amadou had identified, she realized that the safer path might actually be the riskier one. If Henderson's underlying problems were as significant as his preliminary research suggested, her efficiency improvements might create short-term gains that would be overwhelmed by long-term systemic failures. What would success look like? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. That depends on what we discover, Amadou replied. But I suspect success would look like Henderson operating as effectively in 12 months as they do today, but with higher employee satisfaction, lower turnover, and customer service metrics that reflect genuine problem-solving rather than call duration optimization. Karoline found herself mentally calculating the measurable benefits of such outcomes. Reduced employee turnover alone would save Henderson hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in recruitment and training costs. Improved customer satisfaction could translate into increased client retention and positive word-of-mouth marketing. The business case for Amadou's approach was actually quite solid, even if his methods were unconventional. And if we discover that my current recommendations are actually the most effective solution, she asked, then Henderson implements your recommendations with the confidence that comes from having thoroughly examined alternatives, Amadou said. Either way, they get better results than they would from a standard consultation that doesn't question its own assumptions. The reasonableness of his response surprised her. Throughout their conversation, she had been expecting him to dismiss her methods entirely, but he seemed genuinely interested in testing approaches against each other rather than simply advocating for his own preferences. It was a more scientific attitude than she had anticipated from someone whose methods seemed so intuitive and unstructured. There would need to be clear parameters, she said, and realized as she spoke that she was negotiating rather than declining. Specific metrics for evaluation, defined timelines, and agreed-upon criteria for determining which recommendations to present to Henderson. Absolutely, Amadou agreed. Though I would suggest that we let our investigation determine some of those parameters, rather than defining all of them in advance. Part of the value of this approach is its ability to identify success metrics that might not be obvious from the beginning. Karoline felt the familiar tension that arose whenever someone suggested proceeding without comprehensive advance planning. Her instinct was to map out every aspect of their collaboration before beginning, to identify potential problems, and create contingency plans for every conceivable difficulty. The idea of allowing the process itself to shape their objectives felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing whether there was ground below. But she also recognized that her need for complete advance planning might be exactly the limitation that Amadou had identified. If Henderson's challenges were truly complex and interconnected, then a predetermined analytical framework might blind her to solutions that could only emerge through direct engagement with the situation. How do we handle the potential for conflict between our approaches? She asked. What happens when your intuitive methods suggest one direction and my analytical framework points toward a completely different solution? We investigate both, Amadou said simply. Conflict between different approaches is often a sign that we're encountering something complex enough to require multiple perspectives. The goal isn't to prove one of us right, it's to understand the situation well enough to develop solutions that address its actual, rather than apparent challenges? The answer was both sensible and completely foreign to Karoline's experience. Her consulting relationships had always been hierarchical, with clear lines of authority and decision-making responsibility. The idea of working as genuine equals with someone whose methods she didn't understand felt like venturing into uncharted professional territory. "Mr. Traoré," she said, choosing her words with unusual care, "I want to be clear about what I'm considering. This collaboration would be unlike any professional relationship I've previously undertaken. My success rate comes from maintaining clear project parameters and proven methodologies. What you're proposing would require me to operate outside my area of expertise." "Yes," he agreed. "And it would require me to operate within structural frameworks that don't come naturally to me. We would both be taking professional risks." The acknowledgement that he would also be stepping outside his comfort zone was oddly reassuring. Throughout their conversation, Amadou had seemed so confident in his unconventional approach that she had assumed the collaboration would be entirely on his terms. The recognition that they would both be challenged by working together made the prospect feel more like a genuine partnership than a conversion attempt. "What if we're wrong?" she asked. "What if our combined approach produces results that are worse than either of our individual methodologies would have achieved?" "Then we learn something valuable about the limitations of hybrid approaches," Amadou said, "but I suspect we're more likely to discover that complex problems require complex solutions, and that the tension between structure and flexibility can be productive rather than destructive." Karoline looked across the table at this man who had challenged every assumption she had made about effective consulting, and realized that her decision had already been made, not because his arguments had convinced her that his methods were superior, but because his willingness to question fundamental approaches had revealed possibilities that she hadn't previously considered. "I'll need to clear this with my supervisor," she heard herself saying, "and Henderson will need to approve the extended timeline and modified scope." Amadou's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since he had entered the conference room. "Does that mean you're willing to try working without a safety net?" "It means I'm willing to discover whether I need one as much as I think I do," Karoline replied, and was surprised by her own honesty. 3 weeks later, Karoline found herself in Henderson Industries' employee break room at 7 in the morning, drinking coffee that was strong enough to strip paint and listening to the third-shift maintenance crew discuss their workflow challenges. It was not where she had ever imagined conducting business analysis, but she had to admit that she was learning things about Henderson's operations that would never have appeared in any official report. The collaboration with Amadou had been nothing like what she had expected. Instead of the constant conflict she had feared,